some worthy concerns we've been talking about throughout today's show so far. Anthony Herron and Ben Hartsock here on Big Ten Radio, Sirius XM Channel 372. Let's go out to the hotline right now and add Mark Schipper into the discussion here. He is a Fifth Down College Football. You can find him on Twitter at the number 5 Fifth Down CFB, at Fifth Down CFB in the Twitter sphere. Mark, how you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. How you guys doing? Glad to be on with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Outstanding. Really appreciate you taking the time to do so. And Ben and I have been we've been kind of going around and around through a variety of different directions for how the haves and the have-nots and that separation that already existed, how it feels like that's expanding, but then which teams that won't get a seat at the big table, where they go from here. Well, what's your sense for how the years to come and the reshaping, the realignment of conferences and of college football, the teams that won't be in whatever the top tier of the sport is at that point moving forward, what does the future look like for them? Do they still exist? Do they still thrive?
Yeah, really interesting question. Big question. Hard to answer, like you were just saying. I'm expecting to hop back on Twitter after this conversation and find 10 new things have happened in the sport. So it's all happening fast. I think what we're looking at is it going to be a big revolution or a small revolution? Already, I think you could say the small revolution is underway. The big revolution would take a little more time, but it would end with a separate league of big schools and a smaller league of smaller schools. And I think the big schools would probably end up basically professionalized, semi-pro, and whether they reorganize into a new conference alignment or division alignment we'd see how that would shake out. And then the lower tier schools, the interesting question is, what would the connection be to the universities going forward? If that semi-pro league formed with all it was worth and players being paid and likely a collective bargaining situation of some kind, how would the universities keep that attached to the school in the way it is now? How would they keep that college football? I think that's a really difficult question. The second down tier, I think, would likely stay closer to college football. It would be worth significantly less money. There would still be interest, but it would definitely be a step down, and I think they'd have a better chance to keep it connected to the university. So kind of big revolution, small revolution. We're seeing conferences realize we're going to see where all this ends up. So that's kind of down the road. That's kind of what I see as two potential outcomes.
So, Mark, last year I got introduced to you watching you travel on your college football odyssey. I'm not sure if you finished your book, but I know you were working on a book, and you've studied history. And I see at a UCLA game, I see you at an Alabama game. You went on what many college football fans would say is an absolute dream, an odyssey. You traveled the country, seeing all of these meccas across the country. Now that where we stand now, and maybe from the historical perspective, did you go and soak this all in a time where it'll never be the same because of realignment?
Yeah, very intentionally, Ben. Actually, I had two essentially primary reasons for doing the book. And one of them was the urgency of the moment. I said college football is going down its old roads for a final time, and I wanted to experience the game that I loved before it was gone forever. And I don't want to be overly sentimental about that or weep about it. There's a lot of good things that are happening, changes in the sport. But the old sport is extremely special. It's connected to this country in a way no other sport is in terms of being part of its history and culture. And so when I went on these tours, the sport's really built on rivalries, and that's what we must try not to lose with the reorganization. So, yeah, I picked a lot of the most historic rivalries, the games I could use to tell the story of college football and the United States at the same time. It's a bigger story, in my opinion. And so, yeah, that's what I did last year when we got connected. I was on the road for 15 weeks last fall, and it was a great odyssey across this country.
So are there any of those rivalries when you talk about that are in jeopardy here?
You know what's amazing is I would actually say three interesting things have happened with realignment. Normally with realignment, you're losing things. You're getting more money, but you're losing pieces of the sport. I found it fascinating that Texas and Oklahoma went together as a package to preserve what they had, and because they're worth more together, obviously. UCLA and USC came together to do the same. By the way, not the first time they've threatened to do this together. And then with Texas going back to the SEC, we're also going to get A&M Texas back. When Texas, A&M, and Texas went away back in 2011, 2012 era, that was a blow to the sport. You talk about historic rivalries, regional rivalries, Thanksgiving traditions. That game going away was bad, in my opinion, and really indicated where we were going in the future. But getting it back is one of the positives, I'd say, about some of this.
Mark Schipper of Fifth Down College Football here with us on Big Ten Radio. As we're talking about the future of the sport, Mark, and how that may look, then I think Ben's very, very interesting question was, where do those fans go? And it sounds like you do have some concern then that on the other side, like if we crest at a certain point here for revenue and interest, the fans that their programs are perhaps left out of the top tier of college football as it looks, then is there a chance that eventually hurts the margins for the sport?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a real concern. I think there's a lot of concerns in that area. I think it's actually a concern for some of the big programs in certain ways, especially as we move further down the road, because what's going to end up happening is if we get too far away from the roots of this game, if we uproot it and try to grow something new, you're going to get a lot of people who go away. And you're going to need to sell people on this new grove of trees you're growing, this new sport you're growing up, and convince them that this is worth it like the old college football was. So that's for the top tier teams. For the lower tier teams, that they fund their athletic departments with games against the bigger schools. First of all, if we're talking about the group of five leagues and the kind of smaller tier schools. And then the excitement they have of getting to compete against the top of the sport, it sort of compels interest in their program. So if they drop down to playing just against themselves and the smaller conference competition and the less prestigious bowl games, and the bowls is something we haven't even got into, that could change vastly as well, and probably is going to. Yeah, I think those are really legitimate concerns and something I hope the people at the top of the sport are considering, but, when you hear them talk, it doesn't sound like they are.
You mentioned USC and UCLA being a package deal. You had kind of referenced in a conversation we had earlier that USC, UCLA has some history of not being content where they were. Can you kind of shed some light on maybe the history of USC and UCLA's frustration with the conferences they've been a part of?
Yeah, absolutely. It goes back. So UCLA joined the PCC in 1928. USC had been there beforehand. So 3 years before UCLA joined in 1925, Stanford and Cal severed athletic relations with USC over some recruiting issues, if that sounds familiar, et cetera.
In the 20s?
Late, yeah, believe it or not, mid-20s. It was paying guys to get them to play football for you. It goes back a long way. And USC and Stanford and Cal saw things differently, even back then. So that was kind of the first moment. The 51 through 58 period, the PCC, which is the forerunner of the Pac-12, broke apart, disintegrated. It would eventually dissolve and reform. USC and UCLA had a lot of issues, as did Stanford and Cal, as did the University of Washington. The three big urban centers had issues with the rural schools. They were costing them money. They were enforcing rules on their programs that they didn't appreciate. And so as this league dissolved, USC and UCLA, in the 50s, both those schools were powerful. That was UCLA's probably greatest decade. And they both said, we'll play independent schedules. We'll leave this league if we don't get a better situation for football here, because we have sort of a tyranny of the minority schools holding us back from our potential. So they threatened to leave then. The league dissolved. It ended up that USC and UCLA reformed the core of what became the Pac-12 we know today. So they stuck around. But in 1978, when it was the Pac-8, Arizona and Arizona State were all set to join. They went to a meeting. Stanford and Washington stepped up and said, we don't want the two Arizona schools. We don't need them. They're not our class. The TV market isn't that big a deal. We're not going to vote for it. And USC stood up first. UCLA stood up right next to them and said, if you don't let these two schools in this league, we are walking. And immediately Washington and Stanford backed down. Those two schools were allowed in. So now we drift to our era, and Larry Scott is running the Pac-12 and signing the worst TV deals in the country. the Pac-12, a prestige league, is falling way behind. And it got to a point where it was just too late. George Kliavkoff, the current commissioner, I think is a great operator in this space. I think he's going to be a great commissioner. But he got control of this ship too late. It had been the torpedoes had hit. So USC and UCLA looked at it, and everything I'm reading, they were a package deal again. They stepped out together and said, if we come to the Big Ten, do you guys want us? So this is the third time these two schools have basically said this league is not doing it right and we're going to leave, and now the third time has been the charm. They made good on the threat.
And of course, it was a year ago around this time where the SEC made their seismic move in Texas and Oklahoma, reaching out to them and adding the two biggest Big 12 brands. And now, of course, the Big Ten a year later has done the same and bringing the two biggest Pac-12 brands to the Big Ten Conference. I'm wondering which couplet, which duo, which move feels more advantageous for either conference?
Yeah, that's a great question. Interesting question. You know, the thing that's interesting to me about the Oklahoma-Texas move is the SEC is now a super regional league. If you look at the footprint of the SEC, it just covers, blankets the Southeast. So geographically, it made a lot of sense. It's a very cohesive unit. Those schools historically have felt exactly the same way about college football, which is to say they have no anxiety about football teams existing alongside their universities. They kind of have football teams that are attached to universities. Whereas if you go up to the Big Ten and the Pac-12, they've always had a lot of anxiety about college football, and they're kind of universities with football teams, if that distinction makes sense. Mm-hmm. So adding USC, UCLA from a philosophical perspective makes perfect sense for the Big Ten. Advantage-wise, I'm waiting for it to shake out. It's really fascinating. For people who may not know, the Pac-12 and Big Ten have relationships going way back in this game, from the Rose Bowl agreement in 46 to the old Sanity Code, which is an NCAA enforcement code that both leagues loved, everybody else hated, the 84 TV deal. And before they rejoined college football in the BCS, the Pac-12 and Big Ten signed separate TV contracts from the College Football Association, which was everybody else. So the move, other than the bizarre geography, actually makes a lot of historical sense for the Big Ten. So how it's going to work out, I don't know. The Big Ten's coast to coast, Atlantic to Pacific. They got a lot of coverage, and I guess we're going to find out. I would say right now it looks like the SEC's makes more sense, but the Big Ten might have higher potential for what they did.
It feels a lot like a game of Monopoly. Would you rather own Boardwalk, or would you rather own properties all over the board that maybe aren't Boardwalk? That's going to be interesting, an interesting competitive landscape that we'll watch play out in real time, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. It's totally what's happening. It's like, you know, when I talk about conference commissioners organizing the leagues, I call it like an allied strategy, you know, like the Allies in World War II. How are they going to, you know, divide their forces around the globe and you know, pursue their strategy? So, yeah, I would say it is like that. And right now it's just madness. So over the next few years, seeing how this thing comes together, if it does at all, will absolutely be fascinating to watch.
We will be watching it closely. We know you will be covering it well, Mark. Great stuff, man. It's my first time getting to talk to you. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Hey, I appreciate you guys. Great to talk to you, and hopefully we can do it again sometime.